behind the gilded gates of Windsor Castle, where protocol rules every breath and emotion is carefully masked behind centuries of royal training, something extraordinary happened on a quiet Tuesday morning in March. For the first time in decades, the walls that separate the monarchy from humanity crumbled in a single, unguarded moment that would forever change how the world sees the woman behind the crown. What started as a routine morning inspection of the castle grounds became a window into a heart that had been hidden for over 70 years of service. The Queen, known for her unwavering composure and steel resolve, found herself facing something that no amount of royal protocol could prepare her for. In those precious minutes, witnessed only by a handful of trusted staff members, the most private monarch in history became startlingly, beautifully human. This is the untold story of that morning, pieced together from the whispered accounts of those who were there, the secret diary entries that were never meant to see light, and the ripple effects that continue to shape the royal family today. It's a story about grief, love, memory, and the weight of a crown that sometimes becomes too heavy even for the strongest shoulders. The world thinks it knows Queen Elizabeth II, but what happened at Windsor that March morning revealed a side of her that even her closest family had rarely seen. This is that story. The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Windsor Castle like a familiar embrace, wrapping around the towers and battlements that had stood watch for nearly 1,000 years. It was 7:30 a.m. on March 15th, and the castle was already alive with the quiet efficiency that marked every day in the life of Britain's longest-serving monarch. Kitchen staff prepared breakfast in the vast kitchens below, while upstairs, her personal dresser laid out the day's carefully chosen outfit, a simple blue wool dress with pearl accessories that spoke of understated elegance. Queen Elizabeth II had followed the same routine for decades. Wake at 7 a.m., listen to the BBC Radio 4 Today program while her morning tea was prepared, review the day's schedule with her private secretary, and then begin the endless series of engagements, meetings, and ceremonial duties that filled every moment of her public life. But this particular morning felt different, though she couldn't quite place why. Margaret Thornfield, the Queen's longest-serving lady-in-waiting, noticed it first. As she helped arrange the morning papers on the mahogany desk in the Queen's private study, she observed something unusual in Her Majesty's demeanor. The Queen stood by the tall windows overlooking the castle's east terrace garden, her fingers absently turning the simple gold wedding band that had adorned her finger for over 70 years. There was a stillness about her that went beyond her usual composed exterior. "The daffodils are particularly beautiful this year, Your Majesty," Margaret ventured softly, following the Queen's gaze to the garden below, where thousands of bright yellow flowers had burst into bloom, creating a carpet of gold across the manicured lawns. The Queen nodded, but didn't respond immediately. Her eyes seemed focused on something far beyond the garden, beyond the castle walls, beyond the present moment entirely. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a wistfulness that Margaret had never heard before, not even during the most challenging periods of her reign. "Philip planted those," she said quietly, her fingers now pressed against the cool glass of the window. "Not these specific ones, of course, but the original bulbs. He insisted on doing it himself, despite the gardener's protests. So it would be his gift to me, something that would bloom every spring long after." She trailed off, the unfinished sentence hanging in the air like morning fog. Prince Philip had passed away nearly 2 years earlier, but Margaret realized that grief doesn't follow royal protocol. It doesn't announce itself with fanfare or arrive according to schedule. Sometimes it visits quietly, unexpectedly, triggered by something as simple as spring flowers blooming in a pattern set in motion decades ago by loving hands. The day's first appointment was scheduled for 9 a.m., a private audience with the Archbishop of Canterbury to discuss upcoming ceremonial arrangements. But at 8:15, as the Queen made her way through the castle's familiar corridors toward her private chapel for morning prayers, something unprecedented happened. She stopped walking. The The corridor was empty except for two yeoman warders stationed at their usual posts, men who had served the crown with unwavering dedication for years. They watched with growing concern as their queen, the woman who had never faltered in public, never shown weakness, never deviated from protocol, stood frozen in the middle of the hallway. Her breathing became shallow, and her hands, usually so steady whether signing state documents or waving to crowds, began to tremble almost imperceptibly. James Morrison, the senior yeoman warder, had served at Windsor for 15 years. He had seen the Queen navigate national crises, family scandals, and personal tragedies with grace that seemed almost superhuman. But in that moment, he saw something that shook him to his core. He saw a woman, not a monarch. A widow, not the head of state. A human being carrying a burden that suddenly seemed too heavy for anyone to bear alone. The Queen's eyes were fixed on a particular painting hanging on the wall, one she had passed thousands of times before. It was a portrait of herself and Philip from their silver wedding anniversary in 1972, painted by a renowned artist of the time. In the painting, they stood together in the gardens of Buckingham Palace, Philip's hand resting gently on her shoulder, both of them looking toward a future that stretched endlessly ahead. The artist had captured something intangible in their expressions, a quiet confidence in their partnership, an unspoken understanding that they would face whatever came next together. Now, standing alone in the corridor, the Queen seemed to be seeing the painting for the first time, really seeing it, understanding what it meant to look at a future that would never include the person who had been her constant companion through 7 decades of marriage and duty. The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant chiming of the castle's ancient clock tower marking the quarter hour. The yeoman warders exchanged glances, uncertain whether to approach, to call for assistance, or to simply maintain their respectful distance. In all their years of service, none of them had encountered a situation like this. Then, as if awakening from a trance, the Queen straightened her shoulders and continued walking toward the chapel. But something fundamental had shifted. The mask of perfect composure that she had worn for so long had slipped, just for a moment, revealing the profound loneliness that lay beneath the crown. Margaret Thornfield, who had been following at a respectful distance, quickly caught up. She had witnessed the entire episode and understood its significance. This wasn't just a moment of private grief. It was a crack in the facade that the Queen had maintained throughout her entire reign. It was the first sign that even the most dutiful monarch in British history was, at her core, simply human. Inside the chapel, the Queen knelt at her usual place in the front pew, the same spot where she had prayed every morning for decades. But her prayers this morning were different. Instead of the usual requests for guidance in her duties and strength to serve her people, she found herself whispering words she had never spoken aloud, even to herself. "I don't know how to do this without you," she said into the quiet sanctuary, her voice barely audible but carrying the weight of profound loss. "I don't know how to be me without us." The chaplain, Father Michael Hartwell, was preparing for the morning service when he heard something that made him pause in arranging the altar flowers. It was the sound of crying, soft and muffled but unmistakable. In 20 years of serving as chaplain to the royal household, he had never heard the Queen cry. She had attended memorial services, state funerals, and personal farewell ceremonies with perfect composure. She had comforted others in their grief while maintaining her own stoic dignity. But now, alone in the chapel she considered her most private sanctuary, the Queen allowed herself something she had been denied for nearly 2 years: the freedom to grieve openly, without ceremony, without protocol, without the weight of national expectation. The tears came slowly at first, then with increasing intensity. They were tears for all the conversations that would never happen, for the shared jokes that no one else would understand, for the quiet moments in the evening when Philip would read aloud from his latest book while she worked on her correspondence. They were tears for the loss of the only person who had ever been permitted to see her not as a queen, but simply as Betty, the young woman who had fallen in love with a dashing naval officer over 70 years ago. As the morning light filtered through the chapel's stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the stone floor, something extraordinary was happening. The woman who had spent her entire adult life serving others, putting duty before personal desire, maintaining dignity in the face of public scrutiny and private pain, was finally allowing herself to be human. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside signaled that the day's official duties would soon begin. Within minutes, the Queen would need to transform back into the monarch her people expected to see. She would meet with the Archbishop, review state papers, and conduct herself with the same grace and professionalism that had defined her reign. But first, in these precious moments of solitude, she allowed herself to remember what it felt like to be loved unconditionally, to be known completely, to be cherished not for her position or her duty, but simply for who she was behind all the titles and ceremony. The transformation back to her public persona was gradual but thorough. She wiped away her tears with a handkerchief embroidered with her personal cipher, straightened her pearls, and took several deep breaths to restore her voice to its usual steady tone. When she finally stood to leave the chapel, she appeared once again as the Queen that the world knew, composed, and dignified. But something had changed. The staff members who saw her throughout the rest of that morning noticed it, though they couldn't quite identify what was different. There was a softness in her expression that hadn't been there before, a humanity that seemed closer to the surface. She smiled more genuinely at the kitchen staff as she passed through on an impromptu inspection, and she lingered a moment longer when speaking with the gardeners about their work on the daffodil displays. The morning that had begun with such promise for normalcy had become something else entirely. It had become the day when Queen Elizabeth II, in the privacy of her beloved Windsor castle, finally allowed herself to grieve not as a monarch, but as a woman who had lost the love of her life. By afternoon, word had begun to spread through the castle's tight-knit community of staff and courtiers that something significant had occurred, not through gossip or breach of protocol, but through the subtle changes that long-time servants recognize when they've dedicated their lives to caring for someone. The Queen's personal protection officer, Detective Inspector Sarah Walsh, had noticed that Her Majesty's usual brisk pace through the corridors had slowed to something more contemplative. The way she paused to actually look at portraits she had passed thousands of times before suggested a shift in perspective that went beyond simple nostalgia. Dr. Rebecca Summers, the Queen's personal physician, received an unusual request that afternoon. Rather than the typical medical consultation or routine checkup, she was asked to join the Queen for tea in her private sitting room. This was unprecedented. Medical discussions were typically brief, clinical, and conducted in the Queen's study during scheduled appointments. Personal invitations to tea in her most private sanctuary were reserved for family members and only the most trusted confidants. "Doctor, I wanted to speak with you about something that isn't strictly medical," the Queen began as Dr. Summers settled into the chintz-covered armchair across from her. The sitting room was filled with personal photographs, many featuring Prince Philip through various stages of their long marriage. There were pictures from their honeymoon at Broadlands, from state visits around the world, and informal snapshots from family holidays at Balmoral. Dr. Summers had been the Queen's physician for 8 years, appointed after demonstrating not only exceptional medical expertise, but also the discretion and emotional intelligence necessary to care for someone whose personal life was so intensely scrutinized. She had guided the Queen through several health challenges, always maintaining the perfect balance between medical necessity and royal protocol. "This morning, I experienced something I haven't allowed myself to feel in quite some time," the Queen continued, her fingers absently stroking the ears of one of her beloved corgis, who had positioned himself loyally by her feet. "I found myself overwhelmed by grief in a way that I thought I had processed. I'm concerned that these feelings might affect my ability to fulfill my duties effectively." The honesty of this admission was remarkable. Dr. Summers had worked with many high-profile patients, but the Queen's level of self-awareness and willingness to examine her own emotional state was extraordinary. Here was a woman who had spent decades compartmentalizing personal feelings to maintain public functionality, finally acknowledging that grief doesn't follow the tidy schedules preferred by monarchs. Your Majesty, what you experienced this morning sounds completely normal for someone who has suffered such a profound loss, Dr. Summers replied carefully. Grief isn't linear. It doesn't have an expiration date, and it certainly doesn't respect royal protocol. The fact that you're processing these emotions now doesn't indicate weakness. It indicates healing. The Queen listened intently, occasionally nodding as Dr. Summers explained the psychological reality of delayed grief, particularly for individuals who have been required to maintain public composure during times of personal crisis. The monarch had attended Prince Philip's funeral with the stoic dignity the world expected, had continued her royal duties without missing a beat, and had never publicly displayed the depth of her loss. But suppressed grief has a way of demanding attention when least expected. As their conversation continued, the Queen revealed details about her marriage that few people had ever heard. She spoke about Philip's habit of leaving small notes in her briefing folders, usually containing terrible jokes or comments about the day's scheduled appointments. She described how he would wait up for her when state dinners ran late, always ready with a cup of tea, and his irreverent observations about the evening's guests. These weren't the formal memories shared in official biographies or state documentaries. These were the intimate recollections of a woman who had shared a life, not just a crown, with her husband. He used to say that being married to the crown was like being married to a very demanding institution that happened to live in the same house, the Queen said with a small smile. But he never made me feel like the institution was more important than the woman he married. I think that's why this morning was so difficult. For a moment, I couldn't remember how to be the woman without him there to remind me. Dr. Summers recognized this as a crucial breakthrough. The Queen wasn't just mourning the loss of her husband. She was grappling with a fundamental question of identity. For over 70 years, she had been half of a partnership that balanced duty with humanity, public service with private joy. Now she was learning to navigate that balance alone, and the process was more challenging than anyone could have anticipated. The conversation was interrupted by a gentle knock on the door. Angela Morrison, the Queen's new private secretary, entered with obvious hesitation. She had only been in the position for 6 months, following the retirement of Sir Edward Young, and was still learning to read the Queen's moods and preferences. I apologize for the interruption, Your Majesty, but the Prime Minister's office has called to confirm tomorrow's audience. They've also indicated that there are several urgent matters requiring your attention. Angela's voice carried the stress of someone trying to balance respect for her employer's privacy with the relentless demands of constitutional duty. The Queen looked at Dr. Summers, then at the stack of red dispatch boxes visible through the open door of her study. The contrast between her morning's emotional breakthrough and the waiting demands of statecraft seemed almost overwhelming. For a moment, the weight of the crown was visible in her shoulders, the burden of never being able to simply be human without consequences. Of course, the Queen replied, her voice returning to its familiar tone of calm authority. But then she did something that surprised both women present. Angela, would you please ask the Prime Minister's office to reschedule tomorrow's audience for the afternoon rather than morning? I'd like to spend some time in the gardens tomorrow. This was significant. The Queen's schedule was typically set months in advance, with every minute accounted for, and every change requiring extensive coordination. Prime ministerial audiences, in particular, were sacred appointments that took precedence over almost everything else. For her to request a delay for something as simple as garden time was remarkable. After Angela left, Dr. Summers continued her conversation with the Queen, but now it took on a different character. They began discussing practical strategies for managing grief while maintaining public responsibilities. The Queen was particularly interested in techniques for emotional regulation during public appearances, concerned about experiencing another unexpected wave of grief while conducting official duties. The public expects me to be a symbol of continuity and stability, the Queen explained. But this morning made me realize that I'm still learning how to be that symbol without Philip's support. He was my anchor in storms, my source of levity during serious moments, my reminder of who I was before I became who I needed to be. Dr. Summers suggested that perhaps the Queen's humanity, rather than being a liability, might actually be her greatest strength during this period. The British people had watched her navigate decades of change with grace, but they had also experienced their own losses and challenges. Seeing their monarch process grief with dignity might provide comfort to others facing similar struggles. This perspective seemed to resonate with the Queen. Throughout her reign, she had drawn strength from her sense of duty to her people, but she had never considered that sharing her humanity might be a form of service as well. The idea that her grief, handled with characteristic grace, might help others process their own losses was both daunting and oddly comforting. As the afternoon progressed, the Queen made several more unusual decisions. She canceled her evening review of state papers, choosing instead to spend time writing in her private diary, something she did every night but usually limited to a brief summary of the day's events. Tonight, she wanted to explore her thoughts about the morning's experience and what it might mean for her future. She also made an unexpected visit to the castle's photo archive, accompanied only by her senior curator, Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell. Together, they spent nearly 2 hours going through photographs from her marriage, many of which had never been published. The Queen selected several images to have reprinted and framed for a private sitting room, choosing pictures that captured informal moments rather than official portraits. One photograph in particular seemed to captivate her attention. It showed her and Philip in the gardens of Balmoral during a family holiday in 1967. They were sitting on a stone wall, sharing what appeared to be a private joke, completely absorbed in each other's company. Their children played in the background, but the photograph captured a moment of pure connection between two people who happened to be among the most photographed individuals in the world. "I'd forgotten about this moment," the Queen told Dr. Hartwell. "Philip had just told me the most ridiculous story about something that happened during a naval exercise years earlier. I was laughing so hard I nearly fell off the wall. He was always able to make me laugh, even during the most stressful periods of our lives." The decision to revisit these memories was part of a larger process that had begun with the morning's emotional breakthrough. The Queen was finally allowing herself to celebrate her marriage rather than simply endure its loss. She was choosing to honor Philip's memory not by maintaining perfect composure, but by embracing the joy he had brought to her life. As evening approached, the Queen made one final unprecedented decision. She asked her lady-in-waiting to arrange for a small dinner in her private dining room with just a few members of her household staff, people who had worked closely with her and Philip for many years. This wasn't a formal dinner with protocol and ceremony, but rather an informal gathering where people could share memories and stories about the Duke of Edinburgh. The dinner, which lasted nearly 3 hours, became an unexpected celebration of Philip's life and character. Staff members shared stories about his practical jokes, his genuine interest in their personal lives, and his ability to put people at ease in even the most formal circumstances. The Queen listened to these stories with obvious pleasure, occasionally adding her own recollections or correcting details with the affection of someone who had known Philip's character intimately. By the end of that extraordinary day, something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere at Windsor Castle. The Queen had demonstrated that acknowledging grief and processing loss didn't diminish her effectiveness as a monarch. Rather, it deepened her connection to the humanity she served. Her staff had witnessed not weakness, but a different kind of strength, the courage to be vulnerable in service of healing. The weeks following that transformative March morning brought subtle but profound changes to daily life at Windsor Castle. The Queen's household staff, sworn to discretion but deeply moved by what they had witnessed, began to notice their employer approaching her duties with a different energy. Where once she had moved through her responsibilities with dutiful efficiency, There was now a more intentional quality to her interactions, as if she was consciously choosing to find meaning in moments that had previously been routine. Lady Catherine Pemberton, the Queen's longest-serving lady-in-waiting after Margaret Thornfield, was among the first to observe these changes during a particularly challenging week in April. The Queen was preparing for a series of important state functions, including a visit from the President of France and the annual Commonwealth Day celebrations. Historically, these events had been approached with meticulous planning and flawless execution, but the Queen's emotional breakthrough had introduced a new element of intentionality to her preparation. I want to ensure that these events honor not just protocol, but the relationships they represent, the Queen explained to her planning committee during a meeting that surprised everyone present with its philosophical depth. Philip always reminded me that behind every ceremonial function are real people with real stories. I think I lost sight of that for a while. This shift in perspective became evident during the state visit from President Macron and his wife. While previous state visits had been conducted with perfect diplomatic precision, this event seemed infused with genuine warmth and personal engagement. The Queen spent extra time with the French First Lady, asking detailed questions about her literacy programs and sharing stories about her own experiences with educational charities. During the state banquet, she deviated from her prepared remarks to speak more personally about the enduring friendship between Britain and France, drawing upon memories of trips she and Philip had taken to French regions in their younger years. The French president later remarked to his staff that he had expected to meet the formal, dutiful monarch known worldwide, but instead encountered a woman whose wisdom seemed deepened by recent experience. She spoke to us not just as the Queen, but as someone who understood the weight of responsibility and the importance of cherishing the relationships that sustain us through difficult times, he observed. But perhaps the most significant change became apparent during the Queen's private moments with her family. Prince William and Catherine had maintained regular contact throughout the period following Philip's death, but they noticed a marked difference in their conversations with the Queen after that March morning. Where once their grandmother had inquired about their official duties and charitable work with professional interest, she now asked more personal questions about their marriage, their children's development, and how they managed to maintain their relationship amid the pressures of royal life. During a private lunch at Windsor in late April, the Queen had a particularly meaningful conversation with Catherine about the challenges of royal marriage. Philip once told me that the secret to our long marriage was remembering that we were partners first and royals second, she shared. I think I forgot that lesson for a while after he died. I threw myself so completely into my duties that I lost touch with the parts of myself that he loved most. This conversation led to the Queen making an unexpected decision that would have far-reaching implications for the royal family. She began scheduling regular and formal gatherings with younger members of the family, not for official briefings or ceremonial planning, but simply to share stories and maintain family connections. These sessions, which Prince Harry would later participate in during his visits to the UK, became opportunities for the Queen to pass down not just royal traditions, but personal wisdom about maintaining humanity while serving in public roles. The impact of the Queen's emotional awakening extended beyond family relationships to her approach to her constitutional duties. During her regular audiences with government ministers, she began asking different questions, focusing not just on policy details, but on the human impact of governmental decisions. Home Secretary Dame Priti Patel noted that the Queen's questions had become more penetrating, demonstrating a deeper engagement with the emotional and social implications of policy rather than just its constitutional requirements. Her Majesty has always been conscientious about understanding her role, but recently she seems more interested in understanding how that role affects the lives of ordinary people, Dame Priti observed. She asks about the families affected by immigration policy, the communities impacted by housing decisions, the individuals behind the statistics we present. This heightened sensitivity to human impact became evident during the Queen's preparation for her annual Christmas message. Traditionally, these addresses focused on shared values, national achievements, and calls for unity. But the 2023 message, crafted in the months following her March emotional breakthrough, took on a more personal tone that surprised broadcast coordinators and constitutional experts alike. In the message, the Queen spoke directly about loss and healing, drawing on her own recent experience while maintaining the dignity expected from a monarch. This past year has taught me that grief is not something to be overcome, but something to be honored, she said, looking directly into the camera with an authenticity that reached viewers around the world. In our sorrow, we discover the depth of our love. In our healing, we find new ways to serve others who face similar challenges. The response to this message was unprecedented. Buckingham Palace received thousands of letters from people who felt personally addressed by the Queen's words about loss and recovery. Mental health organizations reported increased engagement from individuals seeking support, many citing the Queen's openness about processing grief as motivation to seek help for their own struggles. Dr. Rebecca Summers, who continued her regular consultations with the Queen throughout this period, documented remarkable improvements in her patients' overall well-being. The Queen's sleep patterns improved, her appetite returned to normal levels, and her energy for official duties increased significantly. Most importantly, she began expressing genuine enthusiasm for future plans rather than simply accepting them as obligations. Your Majesty seems to have found a way to integrate your grief into your identity rather than treating it as something separate to be managed, Dr. Summers observed during one of their sessions. This is actually a sign of very healthy psychological processing. The Queen's response revealed the depth of her personal growth. I realized that trying to be the person I was before Philip died was impossible and perhaps not even desirable. The woman I am now includes the experience of loving him and losing him. I can't separate those experiences from my service as Queen, nor should I try to. This integration of personal experience with public duty became the Queen's new approach to monarchy. Rather than compartmentalizing her role from her humanity, she began to see them as complementary aspects of the same calling. Her grief had taught her about the universality of human experience, and this understanding deepened her ability to connect with her subjects during their own moments of challenge and loss. The anniversary of that March morning arrived almost without notice, as the Queen had become so absorbed in her renewed approach to life and duty. But Margaret Thornfield, ever observant, marked the date by placing fresh daffodils from the same garden bed that had triggered the initial emotional breakthrough on the Queen's breakfast table. When the Queen noticed the flowers, she smiled with genuine warmth and picked up one of the blooms, twirling it gently between her fingers. "Philip will be pleased to know his daffodils are still bringing joy," she said. But this time, the memory brought comfort rather than overwhelming grief. That afternoon, the Queen made an impromptu visit to the castle's memorial garden, where a small plaque commemorated Prince Philip's contributions to conservation and environmental protection. She spent nearly an hour there, not in sorrowful remembrance, but in what could only be described as peaceful communion with memories that now brought more joy than pain. The transformation was complete, but it wasn't an ending so much as a new beginning. The Queen had learned that authentic leadership required not the suppression of human experience, but its integration into service. She had discovered that vulnerability, when handled with dignity and purpose, could be a source of strength rather than weakness. As spring returned to Windsor Castle, bringing with it the annual display of Philip's daffodils, the Queen continued her duties with renewed energy and deeper purpose. The woman who had once hidden her humanity behind royal protocol now understood that her greatest service to her people might be showing them how to remain human while carrying enormous responsibility. The staff at Windsor, privileged to witness this remarkable transformation, understood they had been present during a pivotal moment not just in royal history, but in the personal evolution of one of the most significant figures of their time. The Queen's emotional breakdown had become an emotional breakthrough, transforming not just how she approached her role, but how she understood the relationship between personal experience and public service. Years later, royal biographers would mark that March morning as the beginning of what they called the Queen's final chapter, a period characterized by unprecedented authenticity and emotional intelligence in her approach to monarchy. But for those who witnessed it firsthand, it was simpler than that. It was the day a great queen remembered how to be a complete human being, and in doing so, became an even greater leader. The legacy of that morning continues to influence how the royal family approaches public service, personal relationships, and the integration of private experience with public responsibility. The Queen had taught them, through her own courageous example, that true strength lies not in perfect composure, but in the willingness to be authentically human while serving something greater than oneself. In the end, what happened at Windsor Castle that March morning was both extraordinary and profoundly ordinary. A woman allowed herself to grieve, to heal, and to grow. That this woman happened to be the Queen of England made it remarkable, but that she was fundamentally human made it universal.